I'm Mary Ryan. I'm the joint head of the public events programme here at the RSA, and welcome to you all for this week's RSA Thursday event. As we always say, RSA Thursdays are only possible because of the support of our fellows. So if you are a fellow, thank you very much, and if you'd like to know more about the RSA, please visit our website or speak to any staff member here today. Now, it's a great pleasure to be welcoming back Professor Ali Allawi, who was actually one of the very first speakers in our RSA Thursday series when we started it over 2.5 years ago now. So it's great to have him back here today. And to introduce him more formally to you, we're particularly pleased that we have here as our chair Dr. Maha Azam. Dr. Azam has just returned to London from a spell in Boston, and she is an associate fellow here at Chatham House in their Middle East and North Africa programme. Her research specialisms include political Islam, Islam and globalization, and Middle East politics more generally. And she's published widely and influentially in these areas. She's just finishing up a major work on Islamism Revisited, and that will be due out later this year. So I think you'll agree that we couldn't have a more expert guide to today's discussion. So over to you, Maha.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's great to be here, and a great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Allawi. Professor Allawi has served as Minister of Defense and Minister of Finance in post-war Iraq. He is the author of many publications, including the much acclaimed The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War and Losing the Peace, published by Yale University Press. He is presently a senior visiting fellow at Princeton University. Today, Professor Allawi is going to share with us some of his latest thinking from his new book, which is also published by Yale, The Crisis of Islamic Civilization. A very, I think, important contribution to this debate, one in which Professor Allawi argues that there is lack of connection between the reality of the increase of spirituality and attachment to Islam that is happening on a personal level in the lives of so many Muslims, and the disjuncture between that and the expression on a public level of Islamic civilization that he argues is facing a very serious crisis. I think in order to hear what Professor Allawi has to say, and there is a rich number of arguments in the book, I will hand over to you now and then open up for discussion later. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The subject of the lecture today is obviously vast, and I will not try to do it justice in 20 minutes. So what I thought, or 30 minutes, what I thought would be interesting to the audience is basically to reflect on how I, as an individual, came to this. And I think any person cannot really be the ideas and views and even values of a person cannot really be disassociated from that person's background and his journey, as it were, through time. And I think why I wrote this book is a lot to do with the way that my life has unfolded, and the way I personally became engaged with Islam, and then with the broader issues that are raised in the book. I was born into a mildly observant Muslim family in Iraq. At that time, the 1950s, secularism was ascendant among the political, cultural and intellectual elites, not only in Iraq but throughout the Middle East and even the Islamic world. And it appeared really to be only a matter of time before Islam would lose whatever hold it still had on the Muslim world. Even the term Muslim world itself was somewhat anachronistic. People divided themselves or identified themselves more in terms of national origin, ideology or ethnicity, rather than by the religion. So to an impressionable child of the times, it was clear that society and politics was decoupling from Islam. We were taught Islam as a religion in school, and it was mandatory, but I don't think people enforced on us the rules of prayer, or at least in my extended family, young people were not expected to fast during Ramadan. We memorized the shorter verses of the Quran, but the Holy Book itself was left mainly unread, either in drawers or in the entrances to people's homes. The elderly still made their pilgrimage to Mecca, but I think it was more of an insurance policy than an act of piety. And I don't really recall coming across the word jihad in any contemporary version or context. The political rhetoric of the day focused on Arab nationalism, Arab destiny, anti-imperialism, and so on. And a bit of religious fervor popped up during the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Cairo Radio, which had a very significant influence throughout the Middle East in the period, blared out martial songs calling for divine support against the Anglo-French Israeli invasion. But I think that was an anomaly. Women, not only in my own family, but throughout the urban middle classes, did not wear the hijab or the headscarf. And my only personal connection to a pre-modern past was my grandfather, who continued to wear the dress of a dignified old-line merchant. Modernity, it seems, was flooding everywhere. Cinemas and snack bars, cafes and country clubs, cabarets, freely flowing alcohol, and mixed sex parties. Baghdad was becoming more like Babylon. And things, if one reads the memoirs of the times, Layla Ahmed's memoirs, for example, of life in Egypt in the period, I don't think it was different from what we experienced in Baghdad in the 1950s throughout the Muslim world, from Casablanca to Cairo to Damascus to Karachi and on to Jakarta and so on. The Muslim world seemed to have been moving forcefully and in a determined way from its traditional legacy. In fact, one of the most famous books of the period was written by a man called Daniel Lerner, specifically relating to the modernization and the de-Islamization of the Middle East. It was called The Passing of Traditional Society. And it, in fact, forecast the end of Islam as a living legacy in people's lives, as well as in the organization of societies and nations. I first left Iraq in 1958, mainly because we had a revolution and my family was on the wrong side. And I ended up here in a kind of Anglican boarding school. And whatever really interest I had in religion was ground down by enforced chapel going and endless sermons. So in those days I probably knew more about the Bible than I did about the Quran. But still, in those days, I could still sense that there was a lingering attachment to Islam. Every time our history teacher talked about the Indian Mutiny and the barbaric actions of the mutineers, I sort of instinctively flinched. And the same with the Crusades, as a glorious enterprise aimed at Saracens and marauding bandits. So it was still there, it was lingering and somewhere in the unconscious, but I wasn't really also supported by others in the school. There were quite a few Muslims in the school, mainly from Britain's shrinking empire. But by and large, they were not too different from me. They seem to have left their Islam at home. And those days it was modernity, and our presence in England just confirmed that our Islamic past may have been glorious, but it was just that, the past. And the future lay in the West, and the more West, the better. I spent a long time dreaming of America, and I finally ended up there in 1964. Of course, those days, this was the beginning of the great cultural revolutions in the West, 1964 onwards. And we had all these teach-ins and sit-ins and anti-Vietnam demonstrations and so on, in which I enthusiastically participated. But it also became somewhat odd to see the role of churchmen in America. I mean, Martin Luther King was a churchman, and Malcolm X became a practicing Muslim. So it was a bit odd to see religiously inspired people in positions of leadership in movements that aimed at social transformation. And then later on in the 1970s, like most young people, I was probably preoccupied with finding some kind of meaningful way forward, both to fill the spiritual and moral voids of the times. I mean, any of you of that generation would know what the 1970s were like. And I was going back and forth to the Middle East. I was then working in Washington in the World Bank. But still, Islam was a kind of afterthought. And one very curious episode in 1976, I was passing through London en route somewhere, and I saw several posters advertising something called the World of Islam Festival. So between April and June of 1976, London was host to this really quite formidable exercise. This World of Islam Festival was like an event designed to convey all of Islam's richness and diversity, especially its civilizational aspects. And it had a specifically unifying theme. The principles underlying the festival, which was backed by several Middle Eastern governments, as well as a bit of help from the British government too, was that this civilization had a unity to it and could not be seen through the prism of nations and states and cultures and languages. And it was this civilization that was really in display. And one of the great figures behind this movement was a person called the Raja of Mahmudabad. Now, he may be a very dim and distant figure from today, but the Raja, we used to call him Raja Sahib, was in my mind one of the greatest figures of modern Islam. I had met him in the late 60s when I was a student at the London School of Economics here, and I frequently sought out his company. He was an exceptional being. He played a central part in the birth of Pakistan, and he was in fact the chief financier of the Muslim League. But he fell foul of the lethal politics of post-partition India and left and came here. And he had a small kind of office attached to London's Regent's Park Mosque. And in endless discussions with the Raja, this other aspect of Islam began to emerge. You can call it the spiritual, you can call it mystical, you can call it the ethical, whatever you care to call it. It was not the political. Neither was it the world of detailed piety and observance. The Raja himself really was not only spiritual and mystical, but he had even a revolutionary predisposition. He sort of combined Maoism with and I must say he had a powerful effect on me. But equally importantly was this festival. You can imagine London being handed over to various conferences, seminars, meetings. The entire museums were Science Museum had an ongoing exhibition on Islamic science. The British Museum had exhibitions on manuscripts and so on. Universities held constant lectures and themes. Haywood Gallery had an very significant art festival of Islam. So for the time that I had available, I went back and forth. And I mean, the festival subsequently has been criticized as being elitist and really insufficiently representative of the political and social aspects of Islam. And I think the political dimension was overlooked because most of the people who were responsible for it came from this other perspective, what I would call the inner perspective. At the same time, the Muslim diaspora in Europe was not that big, and Muslims by and large were somewhat exotic creatures, and we didn't have the kind of obvious animosity that sometimes you experience these days in Europe. The people who were behind this festival were people who were known as the traditionalists. People like Sayyid Hussein Nasr, the famous philosopher, Titus Burckhardt, the art historian, and Martin Lings, who was the curator of the British Museum's manuscripts. All of them Of course, Sayyid Hussein Nasr was a born Muslim, but Titus Burckhardt as well as Martin Lings were practicing Muslim, and their influence was clear on the publications that came out. These people, traditionalists by and large, they followed in the path of the French metaphysician and convert to Islam, René Guénon, and they linked the creative vitality in Islamic civilization primarily to its spiritual core, and primarily to the need to discover, as it were, the signs of the unseen in all the outer aspects of creation. And to me, it was a very unexpected, and I must say, a very novel and refreshing treatment of Islam. So without actually seeking it, I stumbled on a perspective that was really entirely new and was very resonant in my mind with possibilities for the future. Not necessarily in opposition to the gathering forces of political Islam. And these, of course, began to accelerate in the 1970s as Islamist movements grew up throughout the Middle East and beyond, clamoring for power. And these two currents, often conflicting, have dominated my life, at least, ever since. That is the mystical inner dimension of Islam and the outer political and social expressions of it. And this is the theme, really, of partly of the book as well as today's talk, is that it's the eclipse of the former. And the way that Islam is increasingly seen in terms of its political and doctrinal aspects, that makes me fear for the future of a civilization that is rooted in the legacy of Islam. Of course, a few years after this London festival, the world was turned on its head by the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and political Islam burst on the global stage. And really, whatever one thinks of it, it embodied the hopes and fears of millions of people. And at the same time, a parallel movement was affecting. The Iranian Revolution was a Shia-focused revolution, but the Sunni world, which is the vast majority of the Muslim world, was also being affected by the rise of political Islam in an extreme form. And I trace that to the famous siege in Mecca in 1980, where the Saudi authorities, in order to crush the rebellion, made a kind of Faustian pact with the Wahhabi establishment, whereby they effectively abrogated all responsibility for domestic, social, and educational policies to the Wahhabi clerical establishment, and gave them huge power and influence to do their missionary or da'wah work abroad. And that, of course, coupled with the jihad, as it were, against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which focused the attention of this extreme brand of militant Islamism. So throughout the 1970s and 80s, Muslims in particular, and people generally, were really confronted with a host of questions and assertions about the proper place of Islam in society. Must Muslims strive for an Islamic state? Is the Sharia compatible with modernity, democracy, human rights? And I dare say that every Muslim from that period on has been one way or another exercised by this issue, whether embracing it, embracing the claims of Islamism or political Islam, rejecting it, recoiling in horror, or perplexed and anxious. And these two worlds, the worlds of political action, doctrinal focus, and the world of inner Islam, the spiritual and mystical, seemed again at odds with each other. One of them dealt with and was angry with Islam's subordination, insistent on recognition and power, challenging the status quo. And the other one was the reverse of that, introspective, some way serene, and immersed in the intangible. And the canvas of political Islam was states, societies, and nations. And the canvas of the other was the self and the individual. And to my knowledge, to my experience, the rituals of Islam were supposed to be the bridge, as it were, the connecting one of the connecting bridges between the inner realities and the outer manifestations. It was a form of ethicalization of interaction on the outer stage. But because of the extreme politicization of the religion, it became bent to suit the purposes of the ascendant forces of political Islam. And this unity that I experienced palpably in 1976 onwards, that lay at the heart of Islam, I think became greatly diminished, if not quite destroyed. People could not move effortlessly between these two worlds as they could, I believe, in the past. And when I say the past, I don't mean necessarily in the last 20 or 30 years. I'm talking about the pre-modern period, where Muslims could move from an inner condition to an outer reality and vice versa. There was no dichotomy, there was no, to use modern terms, alienation between the two. Muslims began to be divided into warring sects, and I think the closing of the Muslim mind was an inevitable consequence of this intolerant and exceptionally doctrinaire strain of Islam, Wahhabism, which was fueled by the largesse of the petrodollar states. Now, I think Islamists have been strengthened by the momentous crises that have shaped the Muslim world over the past few decades, no doubt. And as I became more involved in politics, at first against the Ba'athist regime, as an active member of the Iraqi opposition from 1969 onwards, and then as a cabinet minister in Iraq, it became clear to me that few of the Muslims that I encountered, at least in the public arena, were concerned with these spiritual aspects of Islam. And in practice, Islamists in power behave no differently, and frequently often worse than those whom they claim to be better than. And abuse of power, squandering of public resources, outright theft, violence, corruption were all endemic to Islamic-led governments. And if you think about it, in Iraq, it doesn't appear to be an Islamic-led government, but the most of the parties that formed the coalition that allowed the United States and its allies to rule Iraq were composed of Islamist parties. So they can't really wring their hands and say we had nothing to do with it. And to me, their Islam, the Islam of the political parties, and to some extent even the Islam of the doctrinaire dogmatics, had lost or was devoid of any deep ethical content, and was certainly at odds with my own understanding of Islam. I'm not saying really that the preoccupation of the vast majority of Muslims with their outer conditions is in any way reprehensible, but it is certainly deficient. The crises that Muslims face cannot be addressed solely by the political, social, or jurisprudential aspect of the religion. The moral education of Muslims does not interest leaders, does not interest opinion makers, and it's seen in many ways to be a kind of afterthought. As long as you teach people the basic doctrines and dogma, and as long as you abide by one form or another of the Sharia, then that is seen to be enough to qualify you as being either an Islamist or a person who wants to reconnect with the Islamic legacy. There's no doubt that Muslims feel overwhelmed by the scale of the real or imagined disasters that have befallen them. The legacy of colonialism, which is always trotted out, it's true, it has left a very powerful effect of feeling disempowered, feeling unable to control your own space. And then the Western extension, imperial extension into Muslim lands, was something that was not seen before Muslim history. When Muslim lands fell under the control of non-Muslim powers in pre-modern times, most people left. And that's what happened in Sicily, for example, in the 11th century, or in Spain. Left or were expelled. So these issues did not arise in this form. Neither did the things that came in their wake, modernity, secularism, and lastly, and last wave, is that of globalization and integration of states and nations into supranational frameworks, not necessarily political. And there is a sense of being consumed by these accumulating or cumulative retreats. And it is real. I mean, many people face that, and they respond in different ways. But this should not really stop Muslims from, as it were, putting up a mirror onto themselves and seeing that the essential vitality of their civilization has been seriously compromised. In the last 30 years, the divisions within Islam have triggered huge paroxysms of violence. Sectarian, ethnic, and racial hatreds have always trumped the ideal of Islamic unity. I can list crises after crises, starting from the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the struggles in Afghanistan, the post Yugoslav mess, the Bosnian Civil War, post-Saddam Iraq, all of these massive, the riots and disturbances in Gujarat in India. These are not small things. These are events that traumatized and left lasting. But to me, the real gap or dissonance between the outer aspects of Islam and the loss of this ethical core was laid bare to me in post-Saddam Iraq. And it was really to do with the violence that accompanied the change. It was not all inspired by the coalition. A lot of the violence was internally generated. It was launched first by Wahhabists and Salafist-inspired jihadis. And then the counter-terror that came in its wake from 2005 to 2007 was by and large the work of Shia militias attached to Shia Islamist parties. So one way of looking at the Iraq crisis is in fact in this form. It's not the only way, but it's one way of looking at it. And we have in front of me, I lost several people of my own, people I appointed, who were killed one way for one reason or another because of this civil war. And myself, I was ambushed twice. We had a suicide bomber enter into my entourage, killing 3 bodyguards, and so on. So I don't want to belabor the point, but when you see these things in palpable form, they take on a different reality. And at its core was, I believe, the loss of I call it the loss of the sacred amongst those who profess to be Muslims. In my mind, it is not possible to be propelled by an Islamic understanding of reality without a belief in the unseen. You can be something else, but you cannot be that. And when you see how political Islamists in power jettisoned their entire ideologies in a race to come near to Washington, near to power, and an ideology, I might add, for which a large number of their own militants gave their lives, it's really quite frightening to see what happens. And this could be spread throughout the spectrum, not only the Shia parties, but also the Sunni parties. A little known fact is that the major Sunni Islamist party that supported the coalition is the Islamic Party of Iraq, which is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, which is in perennial struggle with the state about its legitimacy. It was really a sad and dispiriting spectacle. And the idea that Muslims have become, or the sense that we've become divorced from the wellsprings of our ethics, the search for a felicitous life, as it were, harmonious and just society and moral virtues. In Islam, I seem to be a pathway to the unseen. And that's when I began to systematically reflect on this thing. I spent the first time thinking about the disaster that befell Iraq and why we ended up in this situation. Iraq is the most invaded country of the 20th and 21st century, more so than Germany. And we were invaded in World War I, invaded in World War II, invaded in the Gulf War, invaded again. So 5 times I counted. So that was the seed out of which grew my first book.
Professor Allawi, I'm going to ask you to wind up.
I shall do that. If you give me 5 minutes, so that I'm complete. So, sorry? Yes. My conclusion is that the crisis in Islamic civilization arises in part from the fact that Muslims have been unable to chart their own path into contemporary life. Islam as a religion, or even as a remnant of a civilization, has not fully surrendered to the demands of a desacralized world. Those who rule over Muslims may behave atrociously, continuing a venerable tradition of misrule, violence, and corruption that has long plagued the Muslim world. But tantalizing thoughts of what might be still reverberate among the masses and even among some of the elite. Islam's encounter with the West and the ascendant forces of modernity have made deep inroads into the outer world of Islam, and equally important into the minds of Muslims. Some may deny it and fight numerous rearguard actions, but this reality cannot be effaced until Muslims confront another harsh fact. All civilizations have an inner and outer aspect, an inner world of beliefs, ideas and values that inform the outer aspects of institutions, laws, governments and culture. But the inner dimension of Islam no longer have the significance or power to shape the outer world in which most Muslims live. Most Muslims, knowingly or not, have lost sight of the centrality of the sacred to their historic civilization. The Muslim world has become effectively desacralized, and that has changed how Muslims think, believe and behave. Islam's outer expression, laws, governing structures, economic and cultural principles have been in constant retreat. Muslims cannot simply partake of the technological fruits of modern civilization while simultaneously questioning or rejecting its premises. That makes them nothing more than inert consumers of the effort and creativity of others, even if they continue to smugly assert the superiority of their own spiritual ways. That is the ultimate fallacy of Islamists. Alternatively, Muslims might choose to package the products of Western civilization in ways that are culturally or politically acceptable to their own societies. They can even participate in the dominant civilizational order and risk fatally undermining whatever remains of their identity and autonomy. But if Muslims want an outer life that is an expression of their innermost faith, they must rescue their own civilization from years of inactivity, lassitude and indifference. Such an achievement requires overcoming conditions of great imbalance and adversity. The challenge is not insurmountable, but it will test to the limit Muslims' commitment to Islam as a way of life. Muslims must invent new ways of expressing the outer dimensions of their religion, a new Sharia, ethics-based rather than rules-based, tilted towards social action rather than preserving the status quo. Muslims must also confront the twin temptations of seeing the Sharia either as a malleable garb for whatever modernity throws their way, or as a fixed creed of intricately detailed rulings. I have no doubt that Islam as a religion or as a code of outer conduct and in transactions will continue. But I cannot say the same about Islamic civilization, a universe that is recognizably Islamic and that draws its vitality and inspiration from the inner and outer aspects of Islam and the bridge that connects the two. It is that world that is in danger of disappearing. Thank you.
Professor Allawi, maybe we can take the questions from here, but I will use the prerogative of the chair, if I may, to press you a little bit, if possible, on the issue of Islam in the public sphere. In a sense, you are clearly speaking about Islam as a civilization, but as Muslims the world over become more attached to Islam on a religious and spiritual level, they want to see an expression of that in their societies on a political and public level as well. So if you take countries throughout the Middle East, for example, people are not necessarily happy to live their private lives as Muslims within the context of their homes. They want to see a reflection of that in the media, where there are programs that don't offend their sensibilities and those of their family values, etc. They don't want to see public spaces dominated by advertising, for example, that shows off pornography or women in a particular way or whatever. And so on and so forth. They don't want alcohol perhaps served in public places. So essentially, even if we were to follow and to accept, which I do very much, your arguments about Islam as a civilizational trend and the importance of that historically and the need to rejuvenate that and give rebirth to that for Muslims to survive as Muslims and for Islam to flourish, what happens in the public sphere? I mean, the challenge remains there. Western governments, secularists in our societies, modernists in our societies don't want to see Islam in the public sphere. It doesn't have to be an Islam that is brutal, but it's certainly a worldview and a law that will function differently to secular law. Or is it not?
No, I agree with you, but I mean, I would in fact make the argument a bit broader than that. It's not just a question of finding ways in which Muslims can socially coexist with an outer world that is dominated by other precepts and other ways of looking, other values. This is probably the thrust of most social conservatives around the world. This is not what really constitutes civilization as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. It's to do with the vitality in dealing with structures, issues, institutions, laws that not only provide a response to their own needs, but are, in fact, they add to the sum total of the human project, as it were. So, for example, in politics, the connecting mechanism between the inner world and the outer expressions of it in Islam, as far as I can recognize, is really the ethical aspect. How do you create an outer structure in institutions, laws, and government that reflects the ethical requirements for justice, for balance, for equilibrium, for fairness? And these have to be expressed in ways that people feel are authentic and are malleable and can adjust themselves with time. This is one aspect of creativity, is how do you create the political and legal and institutional framework. But there are other aspects. For example, even in things like the way that you should allocate your resources for, say, educational research, the way that pedagogical treatment of how you ethicalize a population. Where do you get the creative spark that is now very much in the realm of the postmodern or globalized world? How do you bring it back into an expression that is both authentically Islamic as well as one that has some advantage and interest to others, so that they can see this as a civilization that is adding value, as it were, to the human enterprise. It has been couched too much, as I see it, in terms of how do you adapt institutions and how do you adapt the Sharia to fit a kind of lifestyle or to fit a kind of personal and social ethic. I don't think this is sufficient. This will not be a substitute for the postmodern, consumer-based, technologically based global order. And if that continues, I think it will overwhelm it in time.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's open the floor to questions.
Thank you. I'm Susan Reed. I'm a fellow of this society. I'm a philosopher. I'm a practicing church-goer. But again, I think I make as good a Muslim as I do Christian, because I do believe in the same teachings. And this is something that I believe that everything that you said that applies to the personal and inner state of the Muslim world could equally be applied to the Christian world, and that we too in the Western world have lost our core values and our spirituality, and we are trying further and further to demolish them. So I think that this really is probably going to take a joint effort on the part of all people of faith to change the things around. What way do you see that this can be done whether it's just in the Muslim world, but hopefully to get across the greater power of faith and a state that, you call it an Islamic state, and I wonder too how much this puts people off, that this is a one state, the Islamic state, that everybody belongs to. It's the same as looking at a utopia in a way. It is not meant to be a political state. It is meant to be, I believe, this inner spiritual or outer unseen state. Can you comment on that, please?
I'll comment quickly. I mean, one of the main differences, I think, between Islam and other great spiritual traditions, great world religions, is that Islam really has not abandoned the public space politically the way that Christianity has. Christianity has basically given up on affecting the outer world. It has accepted the premises of a secular state and has withdrawn. It's become a personal or at best a community faith. And this is true really in nearly every other tradition. It's not that Islam is different in terms of its impulse. It's the same. It's to basically to ethicalize outer action. But for a variety of historical and other reasons, the trajectory has been different here. When I say an Islamic state, I think one of the problems is that we have to think beyond states. We have to think in terms of political units and communities that are not necessarily defined by these inherited structures. Immediately people become deathly afraid and say that Muslims want to create the Khilafah and this pan-Islamic world between Morocco and Jakarta, and it's terribly destabilizing and so on. This, I think, is a very narrow, in my mind, quite a limited way of thinking. There are different ways of expressing yourself politically, expressing yourself institutionally, that do not necessarily imply that you want to have political power in the context of a nation state. And we have to experiment with these ways forward. Maybe in some cases smaller units are better. Maybe in other cases very large confederal units are better. And how do you create mechanisms that allow people to control their environment and to feel representative? The way I see it, I mean, modern politics basically has given up, as it were, authority and hierarchy in favor of manipulation. These political systems that do provide some modicum of representation are nevertheless highly manipulated and highly geared and towards serving certain interests over others in a differential way. These are common areas, I think, that we can work on.
Thank you. It's a very interesting talk. Now, it seems that there are two essences of a civilization, of any civilization. And one is, of course, the tolerance of difference, tolerance for dissent. And second is the sanctity of life. Now, on both accounts, Islam seems to be somewhat deficient, that it is not very tolerant to dissent. And sanctity of life also, one feels that it is not something which is held very high in what you call Islamic thought. I mean, witness the troubles in Iraq, Shia and Sunni violence, and not only in Iraq, but in other places also. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think are the causes? Why the idea of sanctity of life is so weak, and that the dissent is the dissent is so difficult in Islam? Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question, just a question on the secular aspects. Do you think it's possible to have a secular nation in the states in sort of Islam with all the aspects of the universal values of democracy, rule of law, human rights, and so on? And is this compatible with political Islam as we see it now, not as in the past? Or would political Islam have to make a compromise with this and accept that all the things that they believe in, they have to compromise and change to some extent to be able to have a secular society as we know it now?
Let's take those two because they're quite big questions.
I have to acknowledge my very old friend and roommate Asghar Naqvi, former EU ambassador, whom I haven't seen for years. So very good to see you again. And you remember the days with the Raja. I'll answer the first question and then Dr. Naqvi's question. I really don't accept the premise of the question, so and I will not fall into this trap. If you want to create a balance sheet of violence and terror, between civilizations, I think Islam, by and large, would be probably higher than, would come out probably much better than other civilizations. You talk about the violence in recent times. I'm not saying it's not a violence. There's no violence in Islam. The ideal and the reality are two different issues.
Within Islam?
Within Islam, yes. But within Islam, at the same time, you don't have these wars of religion that you had, for example, in Christendom, which went on for 200 years. You don't have these huge massacres that you had in the St. Bartholomew's Day or the Huguenots or the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War, Germany's population at the beginning of the 17th century was nearly 30 million. By the middle of the Treaty of Westphalia, it was around 8 million. And this is from C.V. Wedgwood, which I quote in the book. So it is, we have not had large-scale warfare between the sects in Islam. There were disturbances, no doubt about that. But until very recently, these did not break out into large-scale violence. That doesn't mean that we don't have our fair share of violence. We do. But I cannot see, for example, an episode approximating to the carnage that you saw in World War I, which was mainly in the European theater, or World War II. World War I was nearly exclusively in the European theater. World War II was mainly in the European theater. There's no equivalent to this level of violence in the Muslim world. What we see now is in the last 30 or 40 years. So when people talk about draconian measures and so on, they forget that until the 1970s, France used to execute people by guillotine. Rights did not come all of a sudden here at the beginning of the Enlightenment. They had to be fought for. And it took a long, long period before people adjusted. Switzerland did not give the women the right to vote until, 20 years ago. Until now, the United States is the second biggest executioner of people in the world. So you have to take these things. As for tolerance, I agree with you that Islam does not have a philosophy of tolerance. It has a philosophy of accommodation, which is different matter. You create space for other religions and faiths, and you recognize them. Now the question, what happens if you're not a recognized faith, is an issue, by and large. But at the same time, most faiths that operated within the world purview of Islam, especially in the Near East and North Africa, was Christianity and Judaism, and they had a recognized space for it. In defense of Islam, Christians in the Muslim world continued until modern times. But there's hardly any Muslims left in countries which were previously Muslim and then had a shift in frontiers or boundaries or a loss of political control. The Muslim population of Spain was expelled when the Ottoman Turks withdrew from the Balkans in the 19th century. Nearly 5 million people were displaced. And Palestine is another case in point. So there are episodes of great intolerance in Islam, as in other civilizations. But by and large, until modern times, I think Islam's record in accommodation was far better. There were no cases, for example, of huge pogroms or genocidal attacks as you had against, for example, the Jewish population of Europe in World War II. So I can't see the basis of this argument. It is true that people get stoned to death, and these are very violent and unacceptable acts. But to tarnish the whole world is, I think... Other asked about the secular nation states and whether political Islam can tolerate. I don't think Islam can coexist with a secularism of let's call it, of the variety that denies any outer space for religious expression, or denies the right of religious people of faith to express themselves politically. So the secularism, for example, of the Anglo-Saxon world is by and large acceptable, because it doesn't, more so in America and unfortunately less so here, is that it does acknowledge and accept that religious faith can be a determinant of political action. But it subjects it to, as it were, the marketplace of ideas and the tests of elections. But if you have a determinately anti-religious state, for example, Turkey, until very recently, it wasn't secular in the Western sense, not even in the French sense. It was determined to erase the expressions of Islam and to reduce it not only to a private faith, but to a marginal faith. And after 80 years of this, it hasn't succeeded. So I think it's in my mind a silly project by secularists to try to erase the expressions of Islam in the art world. The other way around also is unacceptable, I might add. That political Islam should not impose an ideology on people who don't accept all of its premises.
Thank you. Ramnik Shah, I'm a fellow. You talked about the failure, I think, in the so-called Islamic world to reflect in the public sphere Islamic values. But you may be surprised to know that in the Muslim diaspora in the West, the ideas are catching on, because I give you two examples which have been in the news here this week. One is the increasing use of so-called Sharia courts, and that's a misnomer really, because these are arbitration tribunals, but increasing use by non-Muslims, that's non-Muslims wanting to participate in that form of voluntary justice. And secondly, there is an increasing demand for polygamous marriages to be recognized. Now, these are, it seems, Islamic values which are creeping into the West by stealth. I mean, I speak as a non-Muslim, but that's irrelevant. But, it seems that there is a consciousness of Islamic ethics.
Thanks. I'm Sajid Ali Khan. Professor Allawi, I must say I agree with a lot with what you say, and I'm going through your book, which you inscribed for my daughter, who gave it to my sister, who's asked me to read it. The only thing which I'd like you to answer is, why do you use this expression West and Western? And I'm encouraged to ask you that because we have another thinker in London at the moment, Amartya Sen, who said precisely the same thing on Radio 4. Don't use the word Western and West because it's pretty meaningless. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I was very interested in your comments. My name's Abdul Sattar. I was very interested in your comments on reform of the Sharia. And a lot of writers say that the sort of deceleration of Muslim civilization started when Muslims stopped doing ijtihad, which was a form of legal inquiry into new rules for their society, I think. And I wondered what you thought about that, but also more generally how you think you can actually reform the Sharia, seen as I think the majority of Muslims today do just see it as a rule book as opposed to a system of ethics and values. Thank you.
Regarding the sort of the creeping Islamization of society, I won't call it that. There's certain human nature, I think, is sometimes better understood in one aspect of civilization rather than another. You mentioned polygamy. I can also mention marriage laws now in California. The whole idea of thinking of marriage not as a sacrament but as a contract is in fact embedded in Islam. Islam marriage, it is not a sacramental act, which is the basis of all marriage laws until very recently in the Western world. It is to do with a contractual agreement between two parties. You can write with it what you want. So there is that element of it. Another element, for example, is in the field of economics. In the late 1990s, two professors at Yale called Ackerman and Alstott came up with the whole revamp of the tax code, of the U.S. tax code, which is incredibly complex, and came down that the most fair and the most valid way of taxing people and maximizing public interest and optimizing is through something that approximates 2 to 2.5% net wealth tax, which is very, very similar to what zakat is in Islam. But you try to call it that policy, let's introduce zakat here, and you have an uprising on your hand. It's a question of what terms that you use. Certain aspects, I think, in which Islam views human relationships might be more pertinent to various aspects of the modern world. The view of, as I said, the view of marriage extends also to a type of marriage that is only found in the Shia world, which is called mut'a, which is in some ways a kind of recognition of the boyfriend-girlfriend type relationships. So there are ways in which these roots can intermingle and commingle and create, I think, a far better outcome if we break these barriers that to some extent are determined by language and words and terms that frighten people.
And there's the question about West and Western.
Yes. Using the word, I agree with you. I should not use the word West all the time. What I mean is the postmodern globalized world. But another aspect of it is that it is rooted in the West, and we should not really think otherwise. I don't think modernity could have sprung anywhere else except in the context of Western Europe and North America and the various cultural issues that they had to confront and political issues they had to confront. To think that we live somehow in a post-Western world, it is not true. I don't believe that. We live in a world in which the vast majority of the innovative, creative vitality emerges from a very small corner of the globe. And if we don't acknowledge that and accept that modernity is rooted in the Western experience, and the Western experience is rooted in other experiences, Judeo-Christian, Anglo-Saxon property rights, you name it, I think we're beginning to delude ourselves. It is less, the Western experience has now become globalized. So it is no longer exclusively Western. But I cannot see how Japan and China have accepted, by and large, the premises of modernity and have not rejected it. Their societies, especially in their outer material form, are organized around that. But it's a slightly different twist to it. I think reform of the Sharia is a hopeless task because it's been going on for 150 years, and it has been the constant refrain of so-called modernists. It started with the late 19th century modernists, and by the way, if you want to reform the Sharia, you may get results you may not like. Most great reformers of the Sharia of the 19th and 20th century ended up as being Salafists and extremely rigid literalists, and they went back to the school of, as you know, of Ibn Taymiyyah. So reforming would not lead to what people expect unless you have the goals that you want to achieve and you want to then massage the Sharia to achieve these goals. I think the way out of this conundrum is to bring the third leg in Islam, which has really atrophied. I see Islam as a tripod. On one side is dogma and doctrine, on the other side are jurisprudence and the Sharia, and the third side, which has been ignored, is you can call it mystic, you can call it spiritual, you can call it the inner ethic, but it is the ethical foundations of Islam. So with that leg atrophying, people only focus on dogma and doctrine or on the other. But dogma and doctrine that's not informed by ethics, I think, is a dead end. And a Sharia that is not informed by ethics is very likely to be reformed according to the principles of the fundamentalists rather than the principles of the liberal and the secular-minded Muslims.
Thank you very much. I would love to go on a bit longer, but I think apologies to those who had questions. I think we've got to draw things to a close. I'd like to thank you all for an excellent session and for all your questions. And of course, Professor Allawi, thank you very much for your insights and for your perspective.